She had saved a disabled child trapped in the mud on a freezing night, while men in expensive suits simply stood there, arms crossed, watching. She didn't know that the child was the only daughter of a notorious mafia boss. That night, Grace Delaney was guided by nothing but a mother's instinct. The back door of the old diner creaked as Grace pushed it open. A gust of cold wind rushed in from the alley, striking her face and making her shiver. The dim streetlight cast a fractured shadow of her small frame against the cracked pavement. The night shift had lasted nearly 12 hours, and her legs felt like they no longer belonged to her. The soles of her shoes had split days ago, so tonight she had taken them off, wrapped her feet in thick socks, and walked barefoot. The floor at work had been slick with grease and water, and now the gravel beneath her raw feet stung like needles. Grace pulled her worn coat tighter around her, took a deep breath, and began walking toward the small apartment nearly 3 blocks away. The shortest path home cut through an abandoned construction site, exactly the kind of place no one would advise a young woman to walk through at this hour. But for Grace, saving 10 minutes meant saving a breath for her little boy waiting alone in that cold apartment. Ethan was only 3, a small boy with bright eyes and a wheezing chest that haunted every winter night. The emergency inhaler kept getting more expensive, and the old nebulizer was beginning to fail. Grace had no choice but to keep taking the night shifts, just to cover rent and medicine. Every day was the same loop work. Rush home, care for Ethan, and go back again. There was no space for dreams, or even exhaustion. As she stepped into the construction zone, the soft ground made her hesitate. The rain that had fallen all afternoon had turned the dirt into a swamp. She winced and tried to move lightly, so her feet wouldn't sink too deep. Her canvas bag heavy with water, and the leftover food her kind boss had packed for her swayed with each step. The wind howled through the rusted steel beams scattered across the site. The moon hid behind thick clouds, leaving only a pale trace of light that made the scene even more desolate. Grace stopped for a moment to catch her breath. She pressed a hand to her chest and breathed deeply. Ethan's face appeared vividly in her mind, tiny, curled up under a thin blanket. Lips cracked after every long cough. Grace shuddered. She should have gone home earlier. A sob rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. There was no room for tears in her world. All she could do was keep walking. For Ethan. Then, from the far side of the site, came a sound, a faint metallic scrape against concrete. Grace froze, tilting her head. The next gust of wind carried something else with it. A fragile whimper distant. Trembling, almost lost, she turned toward the direction of the noise. A dim cone of light spilled from a tall street lamp, and something moved faintly within it. Her steps quickened, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. The chill now came not only from the wind. She had never seen anyone here this late, never heard a voice before in such silence. But then, cutting through the dead air of a sleeping city, came a sudden, "Desperate cry. Help me." The voice was small and shaking. It was a child. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. A mother's instinct ignited in a heartbeat. She didn't think she ran. The mud didn't matter. The fear didn't matter. Someone's child was in danger. And she ran, barefoot and breathless, as if it were Ethan's life at stake. She didn't know that this single moment would change the rest of her life. Grace's foot slipped into a deeper patch of mud than she expected. The cold muck swallowed her ankles, clinging to her socks and jeans. But she didn't stop. The cry had been real. Someone was out there. She wove between stacks of steel and debris, keeping to the edge of a half-built concrete wall. The wind picked up, carrying the metallic tang of rain and rust. Ahead, the light revealed a patch of collapsed earth near the foundation pit, and there she saw her. A little girl sat curled in a wheelchair, right at the edge of the drop. The front wheels had already slid past the ridge, and the entire chair leaned dangerously forward. One more gust of wind, away from disaster. The child barely moved. Her hands gripped the armrests tight. Her head bowed, shoulders trembling in fear. The streetlight caught her pale face, streaked with panic. Grace stood frozen for a heartbeat. Beside the girl stood 3 men in black suits, less than 10 feet away. They were tall, broad-shouldered, dressed like men from another world, entirely wealthy. Untouchable. Yet none of them moved. They only watched. One held a phone to his ear. Another crouched halfway, arm extended, but never dared to take a step. The third stood with arms crossed, eyes cold and unflinching. "Oh God," Grace whispered, then shouted, "What are you doing? She's about to fall." No one answered. One of the men glanced at her briefly, then looked away, as if she were invisible or worse. Untouchable. As if touching the girl would be more dangerous than watching her die. Grace couldn't understand and didn't care. That child needed help. She threw her bag aside, drew in a breath, and lunged toward the tilting wheelchair. The mud sucked at her bare feet, slick and cold. She nearly fell face first, but caught herself. Her hands sinking into the freezing muck, she crawled forward inch by inch, keeping her balance while locking eyes with the terrified child. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here." Her voice was soft but steady, though her heart was pounding wildly. She knew she had no time. Each second, the ground beneath the wheels gave way a little more. One more slip, and the chair would tumble into the pit below, filled with shattered bricks and jagged rebar. Grace crouched low, grabbed the back frame of the chair, and dug her heels into the mud for leverage. Her whole body trembled with cold and strain. "What's your name?" "Honey, don't move. I've got you." The girl didn't answer, only gasped for breath, eyes wide with tears. Grace pulled again, inch by inch, dragging the chair backward. Her spine burned, her hands numbed with pain. Then a sharp crack. The left wheel slid another half-turn forward. She couldn't hold it anymore. Without thinking, Grace lunged fully forward, wrapped both arms around the girl's waist, and locked her in a tight grip. She lowered herself, using her own body as an anchor. "Hold on to me. Come on, baby. Hold tight." The girl whimpered, then clung to Grace's neck with sudden, desperative strength. The faint scent of perfume mixed with mud and fear. Grace shut her eyes, braced her body, and with a guttural cry poured every ounce of strength left into one final pull, dragging the girl and part of the wheelchair away from the crumbling edge. Both of them tumbled into the mud, safe but shaken. Silence fell. The men in suits still didn't move. Grace knelt, gasping for breath, arms wrapped protectively around the trembling child. The girl's eyes, still wet with tears, looked up at her not with fear this time, but with pure, instinctive trust, a silent knowing that this woman, covered in dirt and exhaustion, would not let her go. At that moment, Grace didn't know the girl's name was Emily. She didn't know the man walking toward her was her father, or that this night would begin a chain of events that would alter her entire life. All she knew was that she had saved a child, and for her, that was reason enough to risk everything. Grace was still kneeling in the mud, arms around the small body quivering in her embrace. Her breathing came fast, her chest heaving against her forearm. She could feel the faint heartbeat of a life pulled back from the brink. The child wasn't crying, just staring up at her, as if she were the only steady point in a chaotic world. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, pressing into the wet ground with weight that seemed to carry authority itself. A tall man in a black coat stepped forward. His face was severe, his expression unreadable. The fine leather of his shoes was now caked with mud, yet his gaze did not waver. He didn't look at Grace first. He looked at the child. There was something in his eyes, something burdened, neither fear nor relief, but a blend of power and grief, as if he had lost something long ago and now saw it returned. Fragile and untouchable, he bent slightly, extending both arms. "Emily, come here," he said, his voice low and sharp as a blade. The little girl shrank back, burying her face in Grace's shoulder, clutching her shirt tightly. Grace looked up, squinting under the harsh light. She didn't yet understand what was happening, only that the child refused to let go. The same girl who had been clinging to life minutes ago was now clinging to her as if she were her entire world. The man took another step forward, voice unwavering. "I'm her father. Give me my daughter." Grace tightened her hold, her eyes narrowing. "If you're her father, why didn't you run to her when she was about to die?" A sharp gust swept across the sight. No one answered. The men behind him lowered their heads, silent. The man didn't get angry. He didn't explain. He only reached his hand closer. But the gesture made the girl jolt violently, pressing deeper into Grace's arms and whispering a single trembling word, "Don't." In that instant, Grace rose to her feet, still holding the child. Her other hand swung up on instinct and struck the man across the face. The slap echoed through the cold night. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. No one spoke. The men behind him stiffened. Some clenched their fists, but none moved. Grace stood there, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling in fury and disbelief. Even she couldn't believe what she had just done. The man didn't move. A red mark spread across his cheek, but he didn't touch it. Nor did he show anger. He looked at her for a long time, as if seeing the woman before him for the very first time. "You just struck me," he said slowly, almost too calmly. Grace didn't back away. "I don't care who you are. The girl is afraid of you. I won't hand her over to anyone who makes her tremble like that." The child in her arms was still shaking, but now her eyes had filled with tears. One rolled down her cheek, followed by a soft sob. For the first time since being rescued, she clung to Grace like a frightened bird finding its nest. The air between them thickened. The man slowly lowered his hand. "What's your name, Grace?" She answered, eyes fixed on him. He nodded once, then turned to the man in a black suit standing closest to him. "Get the car. We're going home." Then he looked back at Grace, and for the first time, there was something in his voice that sounded almost like respect. "Bring her with us." Grace froze. "I'm not going anywhere. I need to go home. My son is alone." The man hesitated. For the first time, his expression shifted. "You have a child," Grace nodded. 3 years old. "Asthma. I'm already late." He was silent for a long moment. "That little girl, her name is Emily. My daughter." His voice dropped lower. "You just saved my entire world. And I don't forget debts." Grace didn't know what that meant. All she knew was that after that slap, after that stunned silence, she had stepped into a world she could never step back from. And she didn't yet know that the man standing before her was Vincent Marino, a name that could make the whole city of Cleveland bow its head in silence. Grace left the construction site when the clock was nearing 3 a.m. She walked against the wind, mud clinging to her legs from knees to ankles, each step heavy and cold. Her arms stung from the scrapes she got pulling Emily out of the collapsing earth, and her right hand was numb from holding the child too tightly. But what pushed her forward wasn't the pain. It was the image of her little boy curled up in their freezing apartment, without a proper heater, wrapped in a thin blanket that stood between him and another night of wheezing breaths. She didn't call a cab. She didn't stop. She just wanted to get home quickly, quietly, as if the world she had just seen at the construction site had never existed. But Vincent's words still echoed in her mind. His dark, unreadable eyes following her long after she'd turned away. The name was unfamiliar, but the way his men had looked at her and at the child sent a chill down her spine. When she reached the old apartment complex, it took her a few seconds to recognize the rusted iron door. The streetlight above flickered. Barely holding on, she pulled the latch open with a screech, stepped into the dark, damp hallway, and her footsteps echoed off the cracked walls. 3rd floor. Last door on the left. She slipped the key into the lock, turning it carefully so as not to wake Ethan if he was still asleep. But the first sound she heard when the door opened was coughing deep. Dry. Relentless. Grace rushed into the small bedroom where Ethan lay curled on his tiny bed pushed against the corner. His face was flushed, his little body trembling with each cough. Small hands clutching the thin blanket. She dropped to her knees, gathered him into her arms. Patting his back while reaching for the inhaler, she kept on the bedside table. Breathe. Sweetheart. Slow down. Mommy's here, she whispered, her eyes never leaving the clock as she counted his breaths. Ethan looked up at her with weary eyes, tear streaks glistening on his cheeks. After a few minutes, his breathing steadied. He burrowed into her chest, his small hand gripping her shirt, seeking the only safe place he knew in this storm of life. Grace sat there motionless, holding him close. Sweat and tears mingled on her skin. Every soft rise of Ethan's chest reminded her that whatever happened out there, this was why she lived. But then, something inside her stirred a quiet alarm she couldn't explain. She turned toward the small window at the end of the living room. The thin curtain fluttered in the breeze, revealing a narrow gap. A black SUV was parked by the curb outside. No lights on, no movement, but she was sure it hadn't been there before. In a neighborhood this poor, luxury cars didn't just appear. Grace held her breath. She stood up gently, carried Ethan to the living room, pulled the thicker curtain shut, and left the lights off. The apartment sank into complete darkness. She sat on the floor, clutching her son, listening for any sound from the hallway. Nothing. Only the whine of the old elevator and the distant meow of a stray cat below. It could be coincidence, but her instincts whispered otherwise. That car, the strange silence, the way Vincent had looked at her when she mentioned her son, it all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle she didn't yet understand. She hugged Ethan tighter. He had fallen asleep again, his breathing still rough but steady. Grace sat there for a long time, sleepless, wordless, her heart repeating a single silent prayer. Please, don't let them touch my child. Dawn came slowly. The first light of morning slipped through the thin curtain, softening the room's shadows. Grace hadn't slept. She leaned against the wall, arms still around Ethan, who had finally drifted into deeper sleep. Her eyes were heavy, but her mind was clouded by a thick mist of unease. The black SUV was gone. She'd seen it roll away before sunrise, quiet as if it had never been there. But the feeling of being watched lingered. She laid Ethan gently back on the bed, pulled the blanket up, and turned to her phone. A new message from a coworker at the diner flashed on the screen. Grace. Is that you? You're on the news. Grace frowned and tapped the link. The connection lagged, but after a few seconds, an online news page appeared. The headline hit her like a wave. Single mother dives into mud to save girl from death. Cleveland's midnight miracle. Beneath it was a blurry photo, but clear enough to recognize her. Covered in mud, clutching a trembling child in her arms. Someone must have snapped it from afar. Right after it happened, Emily's face was turned away. But the moment the thin line between life and death was unmistakable. Hundreds of comments flooded below. Some called her an angel among ordinary people. Others dubbed her the bravest mother of the year. Hashtags about kindness spread like wildfire. Grace stared at the screen, fingers tightening around the phone. She didn't know what to feel: grateful that her actions were seen, or terrified that now the whole world's eyes were on her, when all she wanted was to live quietly with her son. Meanwhile, far from where Grace could imagine. That same article had reached people who didn't care for miracles or kindness. In a dimly lit meeting room deep beneath an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, a bald man in a light gray suit stared at an iPad. He paused the image at the exact frame where Emily's face appeared faintly over Grace's shoulder. The picture was blurry, but in their world, those eyes were unmistakable. "That's her," the man said, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "Emily Marino." Another man sitting across from him lifted a glass of whiskey, swirled it lazily, and smirked. Vincent let his daughter's face show in public, reckless, or he's gone soft. "Worse," the first man muttered. He let a stranger hold her, in front of his own men. A heavy silence spread through the room. The men who had once watched Vincent Marino deal with traitors on a blood-soaked winter night now glanced at one another, as if they could already smell the iron tang of a crack forming in what they had believed an unbreakable armor. In the underworld, weakness was not allowed to exist. And if Vincent Marino, the man who had never flinched before blood or power, was now showing open affection for a child, it meant only one thing: opportunity. A dangerous one. No one knew who Grace was. But that single photograph was enough to stir questions far larger than her name. Who was she? Why was she there? What was her connection to Emily Marino? And was Vincent truly slipping into sentiment or concealing something far more deliberate? Grace knew nothing of these conversations. While the underworld's eyes turned toward her, she simply sat beside her son's bed, a bowl of cold porridge in hand, staring at the phone screen, where her photo had been shared thousands of times. She placed a hand over her chest, as if to steady her heart, whispering inwardly that perhaps it would all fade soon. But deep down, an indistinct alarm had begun to ring. She didn't know what was coming, only that from this moment on, she was no longer invisible. The next morning began in strange silence. No meowing from the hallway cat. No children crying for breakfast. Only a haze of stillness. Grace had just given Ethan his medicine when a knock sounded at the door. 3 times short. Even and firm. Not the knock of a neighbor. She carried Ethan into the living room and parted the curtain slightly. The black SUV was back. The same plate. The same polished, predatory stillness, like a shadow stepping out of last night's dream. She opened the door. 2 men in black suits stood there, calm and self-possessed, needing no introduction. They didn't threaten her, but their mere presence thickened the air in the hallway. The man on the right spoke in a low, clipped voice. "Mr. Marino would like to see you." "Now," Grace tightened her hold on Ethan. "I'm not going anywhere. I have a child." The man's eyes flicked toward the apartment. "Someone will look after the boy. You'll only be gone for a short while. You'll be brought back safely." Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Martha, the elderly neighbor next door, appeared. "Grace, I'll watch Ethan. Go. They won't stop otherwise." Her voice was rough, her expression anxious yet resolute. There was something in her eyes that told Grace she knew more than she let on. Grace bent and kissed her son's forehead. Ethan clung to her for a long moment before letting go. He didn't understand, only whispered, "Don't be long." "Mommy," she couldn't promise, only nodded and followed the men down the stairs. The SUV glided through the streets like a dark phantom, turning onto quieter roads lined with walls and iron gates. Through the tinted glass, Grace glimpsed large houses hidden behind hedges and stone fences. At last, the car stopped before a massive gate. Another man opened the door for her without a word. Her heart pounded as she stepped out, fingers unconsciously clutching her coat. The Marino estate was unlike any place she had ever seen. Stone walls cool as marble. Chandeliers scattering pale light like shards of ice. Long corridors hung with oil paintings. Guards standing motionless as statues. She was led into a wide office with a grand desk at its center. Behind it sat the man she could not forget, Vincent Marino. He was seated upright, eyes turned toward the window, as though he had sensed her arrival before she entered. Only when she stopped did he turn. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze razor-sharp swept over her, taking in every detail: the worn shoes, the dried mud on her jeans, the faint scratch across her right hand. Grace Delaney, 26, night shift waitress at the diner near 12th Street. Lives in East Side apartments with a 3-year-old son named Ethan. No record. No debts. No affiliations. A file so clean it's almost suspicious. His tone was even neither angry nor demeaning, just a statement of facts. Yet to Grace, every word sounded like the tightening of invisible chains. "You investigated me?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Vincent didn't answer immediately. He rose, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements measured. Stopping before her, he said quietly, "I needed to know who touched my daughter." Grace met his gaze not with fear, but a weary kind of defiance. She drew a breath. "I'm not a spy. Not anyone's enemy. I saw a child about to fall into a pit, and no one moved. So I did. Because I'm a mother, too." Her words rang through the grand room like a bell. For a fleeting moment, Vincent's face changed, not clearly with surprise or emotion, but with something deeper. Something even he didn't recognize. He said nothing. Neither did she. Silence filled the space. Thick, yet strangely intimate. The quiet understanding between two souls from worlds that should never meet: a powerful lay guarded man and a poor, exhausted single mother. Between them stood a child, Emily, who had bound their fates together in a way neither could undo. Vincent remained motionless long after her words faded. He didn't respond, didn't issue orders. He only gestured for a guard to enter and murmured, "Call my personal physician. Have Emily examined again? And inform the nurse. There may be a change of plans." Grace was shown to a sitting room, spacious, elegant, its velvet chairs and tall windows overlooking a winter garden. No one spoke to her. No one asked her anything. But no one dismissed her either. She sat there, uneasy, thinking of Ethan and the clock ticking in her mind. "I have to get back soon. He needs his medicine." Then the door opposite her opened slightly. A soft voice carried across the hall. "Daddy, I want to see her." Heads turned toward the sound. A wheelchair rolled forward. And there she was, Emily, the small girl from that night. Head tilted gently, face still pale, but her eyes alight with something new, like a faint flame rekindled after years of darkness. She lifted her gaze to her father. "I want to see her." Vincent looked genuinely taken aback. He glanced at the physician beside him, then back at his daughter. "Emily, are you sure?" Emily nodded slowly. "Because she held me. Like a mother." The words froze everyone in the room. Grace was too startled to grasp their full meaning, only saw Emily's little hand reaching out. Waiting, without hesitation, Grace rose and approached. No one stopped her. When her hand met Emily's, the girl grasped it tightly, as if afraid the moment would vanish if she let go. Grace knelt until their eyes were level. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly, her tone as gentle as when she soothed Ethan through a fever. "My name is Emily." The girl replied clearly, with quiet strength. Grace smiled. "And I'm Grace. Thank you for letting me see you." Emily squeezed her hand tighter, turned to her father, and said the one thing no one in that house had expected. "I want her to stay." The air froze in place. Vincent looked at his daughter, then at Grace, and for the first time in years, hesitation flickered in his eyes. Frank, the trusted bodyguard, took a step forward, about to speak, but Vincent raised a hand to silence him. He was watching, closely, as if searching for a single crack, a trace of deceit on Grace's face. But all he found was warmth spreading across her expression as she held Emily's hand. Emily had always lived in a glass box. She rarely spoke. No one but her father and a private nurse was allowed near her. She had never initiated contact with a stranger. Never asked anyone to stay. Yet now, in front of everyone, this fragile little girl had placed her entire trust in a woman who had entered her world less than a day ago. "Why do you want her to stay?" Vincent asked again. Unable to hide his disbelief, Emily tilted her head slightly, thinking, then said softly but firmly, "Because when I'm in her arms, I'm not afraid." Grace couldn't look at Vincent. Her heartbeat stumbled. It wasn't fear that shook her. It was the realization that she had reached a child's heart. A child who had lived surrounded by walls of wealth and loneliness was now feeling the raiden. Perhaps for the first time. A kind of love that asked for nothing in return, not from duty or pity, but from something simple and primal. The kind of love one mother instinctively gives to any child who needs to be held. Vincent stepped closer. The coldness in his gaze softened into something harder to define. He looked at his daughter. Then at Grace. "Do you want to stay?" Grace lifted her eyes. Her voice trembled slightly. "I have a little boy. Ethan. He's sick. I can't leave him." Vincent nodded. "I know. And I'm not asking you to choose. But, if you want, we can make arrangements for both of you." For the first time since entering this mansion, Grace felt the invisible thread connecting her and Emily tighten, turning into something real. Undeniable. And she knew that whatever decision she made, the moment Emily reached for, her hand had already changed everything. Vincent walked toward the large window where the pale afternoon light cast long reflections over the marble floor. He stood there for a long while, straight-backed, hands in his pockets, as though weighing something too heavy to name. Behind him, Grace still knelt beside Emily, the little girl's hand clinging to hers. No one spoke. None needed to. The silence itself hung delicate. Fragile, one breath too loud could shatter it. Finally, Vincent spoke, his voice lower than usual, deliberate. "Emily hasn't bonded with anyone but me and a few trusted staff for nearly a year. She's been through more than any child should. The doctors told me to hire professionals, certified, experienced caregivers, but none of them made her smile. None made her reach out. Until you." When he turned back, the look in his eyes was no longer that of a mafia boss. It was a father's gaze, heavy with helplessness beneath a calm exterior. He didn't hide it. He stepped forward, stopping just a few feet from her. "I want to offer you a position here," he said quietly, "to be Emily's caregiver." Grace froze. Before she could respond, he continued, each word crisp and measured, like an unwritten contract being spoken aloud. "You'll have your own room. Your only task will be to care for her, to keep her company, to help her live. I'll make sure your son Ethan receives proper medical care. I know about his asthma. He'll have his own doctor. I can give both of you a different life, safer, fuller." "But," Vincent posed, his voice cooling again, "you must understand. This is not an ordinary world." Grace didn't answer right away. She looked down at Emily, who was gazing up at her with expectant, tender eyes. The look reminded Grace of the night, years ago, when Ethan first tugged at her sleeve and whispered "Mommy" for the first time during a stormy night in the hospital. She had thought she could never love anyone as fiercely as she loved Ethan, but the way Emily held her hand now carved a new softness into her heart she didn't know existed. And yet, reason pulled her back. This was the world of the mafia, of power, of guns, of things she had never wanted to touch. If she stayed, she wouldn't just risk herself but Ethan too. One wrong decision could put them both in the crosshairs. She looked up at Vincent again, her voice trembling but steady. "I'm a single mother. I'm used to having nothing. I can live with hunger, cold, or pity, but I can't put my son somewhere I don't understand. I need time." Vincent didn't seem surprised. He nodded once. I understand. But you also know the world out there isn't kinder. And I don't make this offer twice. Grace swallowed hard. She knew he meant it. A man like Vincent Marino didn't deal in patience. Yet he had given her a choice, and that, in itself, it was rare. He turned toward the door, pausing before leaving. Frank will take you and your son home. You have until tomorrow night to decide. If you agree, simply say yes to the gate guard. Everything else will be arranged. The door closed behind him, leaving Grace and Emily alone in the wide, echoing room. The little girl still held her hand, whispering, half asleep. You'll come back, won't you? Grace didn't answer. She only squeezed the small hand once more before standing, her heart swelling with a strange mix of fear and longing, as if she were being pulled into something she couldn't yet name. She didn't know if she should return, but one thing she did know: if she stayed, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Grace returned to the Marino estate the following evening, holding Ethan's hand in one and gripping the strap of her worn canvas bag with the other. She had stood at the gate for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the tall iron fence and the silent guards behind it. A single soft word, yes, escaped her lips, and the gate opened soundlessly, as if it had been waiting. Frank himself came to greet them. He said little, only glanced at the 3-year-old boy clutching his inhaler, then led them to the West Wing guest quarters. The room was modest but complete, clean, warm, and more comfortable than anywhere Grace had ever lived. No unnecessary luxury, but everything had been prepared with care, as though it had been waiting for her and Ethan all along. That night, for the first time in years, Grace and her son slept on a real bed with a soft mattress and a thick blanket. No coughing echoing through the night. No dripping faucet from the old apartment. Ethan lay quietly, hugging a new stuffed bear that had been left on his pillow, and drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. Grace sat beside him, gazing out the window at the garden bathed in golden light from the hall lamps. Caught between serenity and unease, the next morning, she began her new life. Emily greeted her shyly but with a faint spark in her eyes. Grace sat beside her bed without speaking, holding out a picture book filled with animals that she'd borrowed from the library before moving. Emily studied it for a moment, then nodded. When Grace opened to the first page and began to read, her voice gentle and rhythmic like small waves brushing the shore, Emily smiled. Within days, the change was undeniable. Emily ate better, slept longer, and sometimes even laughed softly. Shyly, when Grace mimicked animal voices or sang old nursery songs, the nurses began noting the improvement in her emotional and physical state. Progress they hadn't achieved for months, despite every therapy. Vincent knew. He said nothing. He simply stood by the window, watching as Grace read to his daughter. A quiet, unnameable emotion stirring inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Not everyone looked at Grace with that same gentleness. The bodyguards in the Marino estate, especially those closest to Vincent, did not trust her. They watched her every step, tracked every phone call, even counted how many times she left her room. To them, she was an outsider, a poor woman who had no business being inside the home of a mafia boss. The fact that their employer allowed her to stay, to be near his daughter as if she were family, there was something beyond comprehension, and that unease burned quietly, like a hidden flame in dry grass. Frank never showed open hostility, but his silence was enough to make Grace feel the invisible wall between them. Once, while she was walking with Emily through the garden, a bodyguard named Marco happened to step into the narrow path leading back to her quarters. His stare wasn't overtly cruel, but it wasn't friendly either. It was a wordless reminder of the distance she could never cross. Grace didn't react. She had grown used to skeptical looks all her life, though this time, those eyes came with guns under their coats. Still, she didn't back down. Every morning she rose early, made soft porridge for Emily herself, read books, played chess, cut paper shapes with her, as if the world outside didn't exist. And Emily, like a bud that had been too long in the shade, began to open little by little, revealing colors no one else had ever seen. One night, as Grace was fixing Emily's pillow, the little girl whispered, "If my mom were still alive, I think she'd be like you." Grace froze, her hand suspended midair. The words hit her quietly but deeply, dissolving every doubt, every fatigue, every fear. In Emily's eyes, she was no longer an intruder. She had become part of the child's small, a fragile world apart, no one could take away, no matter how many guards stood outside. That afternoon, sunlight filtered through the golden maple trees in the garden, casting long patterns across the playroom floor. Grace sat cross-legged amid a sea of books and stuffed animals, while Emily sat in her wheelchair, brown hair falling softly over her forehead, eyes glinting with a secret excitement. In Grace's hands was an old picture book, the corners worn from years of use, Sir Scruffy Bear and his journey to the Candy City. She had read it to Ethan so many times, she knew every line by heart. But this time, she changed her voice, playing the part of the bearded bear with an exaggerated French accent, half comic, half clumsy. "Bonjour, Mademoiselle Petite," she said in a gravelly tone, bouncing her shoulders like a dancing bear. "I come from the city of caramel, where instead of brushing your teeth every morning, you chew mint gum to wake up your brain." Emily stared at her, wide-eyed, gripping the wheelchair armrests as though holding back something bubbling inside her chest. Then, when Grace started miming the bear getting stuck in a pool of honey and crying, "Help, my beard is covered in strawberry jam," Emily let out a small, soft giggle. It wasn't loud. It wasn't long. But it was enough to stop the world. Grace's head snapped up. Emily quickly covered her mouth, cheeks flushing red with embarrassment. But when Grace widened her eyes and switched to a squeaky gatekeeper cat voice, high-pitched and whistling like wind through a straw, Emily burst into laughter. Real, bright laughter. A cascade of pure sound that filled the room. Grace froze, feeling her throat tighten, her heart squeeze painfully. This child had lived surrounded by silence, by pity, by shadows, and now she was laughing. Not for therapy, not out of obligation, but because of a silly story, because of a woman who wasn't perfect. Outside the door, Frank stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the cold stone wall. He had been there from the start, watching through the one-way glass panel on the door. When he heard that first laugh, his body stiffened not from emotion, but from concern. Frank had served the Marino family for nearly 20 years. From the days he was the right hand of Vincent's father until now. He knew every shift in Vincent's tone, every flicker of his gaze, every subtle change in his demeanor, and he understood, better than anyone, that in their world, softness wasn't a virtue, it was a weakness. Lately, Vincent had changed. Not much, but enough for Frank to notice. He was quieter in meetings, distracted, his gaze often wandering toward the garden where Grace and Emily spent their afternoons. Worst of all, he had dismissed the earlier suggestion to remove the outsider, something he would have once done without hesitation to anyone who came near his daughter. Later that evening, Frank entered a small conference room beside the library, where 3 of Vincent's most trusted men were waiting. Marco spoke first. She made the girl laugh. "Everyone thinks that's good. But I'm not sure." Frank didn't argue. He stared at the whiteboard covered with photographs Grace at work, Grace's past addresses, and even one of Ethan asleep in her lap at a free clinic. They had gathered it all from the moment she stepped inside the estate. "Vincent is changing," Frank said quietly. "And if he grows weaker," he paused, glancing at each man in turn, "the other families won't stay quiet." One of them whispered, "You think there'll be war?" Frank's voice was low, Deliberate. I think there'll be blood. The room went silent. Wind whistled faintly through the doorframe. A sound like warning. They didn't hate Grace, but she was an unpredictable piece on a deadly chessboard. And in their world, every mistake was paid for in blood. Even laughter could be the first shot of a war. Frank, who had always placed the Marino family's survival above all else. I knew that if one day he had to choose between Vincent's safety and Grace's life, the choice would not take him long. That morning, the sky was a dull gray, clouds thick and heavy over Cleveland. Vincent personally oversaw preparations for Emily's physical therapy session at a rehabilitation center 30 minutes from the estate. He couldn't go himself, but he assigned Frank and his elite security team to escort her. A bulletproof SUV was readied, flanked by 2 lead vehicles and 2 follow cars. Routes were double-checked. In the Mafia's world, this wasn't just a trip, it was a test to see who was watching, who was waiting to strike. Grace sat beside Emily in the middle row. The girl wore a pale gray sweater and a soft pink scarf, the one Grace had knitted the night before. Emily said little, gazing out the window with quiet anticipation. Grace squeezed her hand gently, smiling. We'll be there in less than an hour. And then I'll tell you part 2 of Sir Scruffy Bear's story. Okay, Emily nodded faintly. The convoy turned onto a smaller side road. The main route was under repair. That was when Frank noticed something wrong. The lead SUV suddenly slowed. From both sides of the road, 2 silver pickup trucks swerved out, blocking the front and rear. Almost simultaneously, a third vehicle cut off their escape from behind. No sirens, no warning, just the heavy silence before violence. Then the truck doors swung open. Men in black, faces masked, rifles in hand, moved like shadows through the fog. Frank's voice cut through the comms. Protect the target. No one gets near her. But it all happened too fast. A smoke grenade hit the lead car, and thick white clouds swallowed the road. Grace's pulse spiked. She pulled Emily into her arms as the left side window shattered with a crash. Shouts erupted outside orders. Gunfire. Schaus. Down one guard yelled, shoving Grace and Emily to the floor. Grace's back slammed into the seat base, her arms locking around the trembling girl. Emily's breathing turned ragged, her whole body shaking. Unable to scream, gunfire cracked outside. This was no warning. These were real bullets. Frank threw open the front door, pistol drawn, and took cover beside 2 of his men. The fight erupted in the narrow road flanked by trees, a storm of bullets in the gray morning. The attackers weren't here to rob. They weren't here for money. Their target was clear, the middle SUV, the one carrying Emily Marino. One of the attackers reached the rear door, tugging hard at the handle. Grace heard the sharp scrape of metal and caught a glimpse of a rifle butt forcing its way through the crack. Without thinking, she threw herself over Emily, shielding the girl with her body as she screamed, "Don't you dare touch her." The only guard left inside had been shot in the shoulder. He tried to crawl toward the front seat, fumbling for his gun. But the situation was slipping completely out of control. A bullet fractured the windshield. One rear tire blew, sending the SUV tilting dangerously to one side. Grace could feel the powerlessness thickening in the air. She had never been this afraid before, not of dying, but of failing to protect the child who had trusted her. The child who had laughed because of her. "We can't just sit here," she said under her breath, firm but unheard in the chaos. Outside, Frank's voice cracked through the radio, demanding reinforcements, but the signal was dead, jammed. Someone inside the system had betrayed them. Grace turned, crawling toward the front where the driver's seat stood empty. Instinct had taken over. Emily's wide, terrified eyes followed her. Grace knew that if they stayed, they'd be sitting targets. She had no choice. What surged inside her wasn't fear. It was something primal and ferocious. The kind of strength only a mother knows. She could hear nothing now but her own heartbeat, pounding like drums inside her chest. Smoke. Metal. The faint tang of blood. The air was thick. Suffocating. She wanted to retch but didn't have the luxury. There was no time for fear. No room for hesitation. She glanced back at Emily, crouched behind the seats, her tiny hands gripping the cushions until her knuckles turned white. No crying. No screaming. Just those wide eyes begging her not to leave. Grace crawled forward, scraping her arm on shattered glass. A long gash tearing through her skin. She didn't feel it. She climbed into the driver's seat, hands trembling as she grabbed the wheel. The key was still in the ignition. She slammed her foot down on the gas. The SUV hesitated for a second, as if stunned by her audacity, then roared to life, lunging forward like a beast breaking its chains. The wheels skidded over gravel, flinging mud and stones into the air. Someone outside shouted. But too late. The vehicle rammed between two silver trucks, sending one man sprawling aside. Grace twisted the wheel, swerving sharply, right as a burst of gunfire cracked through the air. Bullets tearing into the metal frame. The left window splintered but held. She gritted her teeth and pressed harder on the accelerator. Behind her came a sound fragile, shaking, but filled with faith. "Miss Grace." Emily's voice was barely more than a breath, trembling like a leaf in winter wind, but clear enough to reach through the gunfire and the engine's roar. Grace didn't look back. She couldn't. Every second her eyes left the road was a second closer to death. The narrow forest road twisted and dipped, slick from last night's rain. Potholes and puddles flashed beneath the headlights. The SUV fishtailed once, twice, but she steadied it, knuckles white on the steering wheel. There was no thinking now, only instinct. She veered down a side road that led toward the southern neighborhoods of Cleveland, the same route she used to walk years ago from her old apartment. Every turn was muscle memory. She drove like a woman who had been preparing her whole life for this single moment. Behind her, Emily stayed silent, her tears running freely now. But she didn't sob. Somehow, she understood. Staying calm was the only thing keeping them both alive. After several minutes, the gunfire faded. No one followed. Maybe Frank and the others had fought off the attackers, or maybe the ambushers hadn't expected anyone to break their line and were too stunned to pursue. Grace didn't know. She didn't care. Each mile she covered, each turn she survived, was a prayer whispered in her heart for Ethan and for Emily. When the first streetlight of the city came into view, Grace hit the brakes. The tires screamed. The SUV skidded several feet before stopping. Smoke curled up from the wheels. She stayed frozen, hands locked on the steering wheel, breath ragged. Her head dropped forward, as if every ounce of strength had drained from her body. Then, from behind, a small movement. Emily had unbuckled herself, dragging her fragile frame toward the front seat. Her tiny hand, trembling, reached out and rested on Grace's shoulder. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. Grace lifted her head, eyes red, and reached back to pull Emily into her arms. She held the girl tightly, afraid that if she let go, the nightmare would come crashing back. The engine was still running, headlights casting long beams down an empty alley. Grace sat there, trembling, breath shallow, mind spinning, but she knew one thing: as long as Emily was alive and breathing beside her, she would keep going. She had once thought herself just a small, struggling single mother in a city too big to notice her. But now, behind that steering wheel, under gunfire and smoke, she had become the entire world to a child everyone else had forgotten. Vincent Marino stood by his office window, a glass of amber liquor in his hand, eyes fixed on the courtyard below where the cars were returning. Dusk had fallen. The light from the front gates glowed through the thin veil of fog, making everything shimmer like a dream. he wasn't sure he wanted to wake from. The black SUV rolled through the gates, scratched, dented on one side, streaked with blood on the door handle, moving slowly. Like a survivor limping home from battle. Frank entered moments later. His coat stained, his arm roughly bandaged. His face, however, was calm, sharp as always. For 5 long seconds. He said nothing. Vincent turned, meeting his eyes. The unspoken command was clear. Report. Everything. We were ambushed, Frank said, his voice rough from smoke and strain. 3 vehicles. Armed. Tactical. Someone leaked the route. I'm certain of it. He paused, steadying his breath. But what you need to know is this. Grace took the wheel. She got Emily out. Vincent didn't respond right away. He set the glass down and stepped closer to the window, his fingers brushing absently along the polished mahogany desk. The words echoed in his head. Grace got Emily out. In the 2 years since Emily's mother died, no one had reached the girl. No doctor. No nurse. No relative. Only Grace. And now, she hadn't just made the child smile, she had driven through gunfire to save her life. Frank stood silently. Then after a long pause, spoke again. She's not just help. See her. She didn't do it for money. She did it like a mother. Vincent turned to him. He said nothing. But something in his gaze had changed. He was not a man easily moved. His life had been built on loss, betrayal, and blood. His heart hardened long ago. Yet Grace, with her frayed sweater, her muddy hands, and those steady eyes that had never flinched before him, had entered his life uninvited and unafraid. And now, she had saved the only thing left that tethered him to humanity. How's Emily? His voice was low, almost a whisper. Safe, Frank replied, shaken, but unhurt. Grace hasn't left her side. He hesitated, then added quietly, she's reckless, but not stupid. Drives like she's had training. Vincent didn't smile, but something faint, an almost imperceptible shift, touched the corner of his mouth. He reached for his glass again, watching the slow swirl of whiskey against the light. In his mind, he saw Grace holding Emily, the woman who had once trudged through mud in the dark to save a stranger's child, now risking her life again for that same little girl. No one does that twice, he murmured, more to himself than to Frank. Not just out of kindness. Frank nodded. Maybe not. Or maybe she's just the kind of person who never looks away when someone needs saving. Vincent remained silent longer than usual. Then, slowly, he set the glass back on the table. His eyes no longer drifted into the void but fixed on a clearer image. Grace, a woman with no power, no wealth, no protection, and nothing left to lose except the 3-year-old boy sleeping in the room next door. Double the security, he said at last, his voice regaining its usual steel, and assign someone to stay close to Grace, not to monitor her, to protect her. Frank blinked, surprised. But he didn't argue. He understood. When Vincent Marino gave an order to protect someone, as if protecting his own blood, the ground had already shifted. Grace was no longer merely the woman who drove through gunfire to survive. She was becoming something the boss himself dared not name a weakness. Or perhaps the last shard of humanity, still beating in his frozen heart. That night, Vincent sat alone in his upstairs study. The light from an old brass lamp, falling across a dark oak desk scarred by time. Beside him lay a slim folder, not filled with contracts or financial ledgers, but with photographs. The first showed Grace asleep on the couch, arms wrapped protectively around Emily, as if afraid the child might vanish in her sleep. Both faces were calm in a way that felt unreal, as if the world outside had stopped existing. Grace's hair spilled across her cheek, her blouse still stained with dried blood from the ambush. Emily lay nestled against her. Small fingers locked around Grace's index finger, holding on as though even in dreams she feared someone might take her away. The door opened quietly. Frank entered, his footsteps heavier than usual. The air in the room was dense, charged like the moment before a storm. He stood still for a few seconds before speaking, his voice steady but edged with gravity. "You know I don't say this easily, but it's time you reconsider Grace Delaney." Vincent didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the photograph, silent, as though he hadn't heard. Frank went on, each word falling heavier than the last. "I understand she saved Emily. No one denies that. But she doesn't belong here. She's an outsider. And when outsiders get too close, too deep, the others notice. They sense change. They see weakness." Vincent's silence deepened. His gaze shifted to the next pictures, Grace brushing Emily's hair in front of a mirror, the two of them sharing ice cream in the kitchen, Emily giggling as Grace tickled her. Little fragments of normal life things Vincent had once dismissed as useless luxuries now pulled at him in ways he didn't know how to resist. He'd built his empire on the belief that feelings were fatal indulgences, yet those same feelings had brought Emily back to life. And, disturbingly, they were beginning to make him feel alive again. 2. Frank set a document on the table. "She's a double-edged blade. Vincent, yesterday won't be the last time. There will be others coming, not for you, but for her. Once they know you keep a woman with no background, no protection, no weapon under your roof, and worse, near your daughter, they'll see it for what it is, your heart on display." Vincent leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked. His face gave nothing away, but behind his eyes a battle raged. Frank was right. In their world, trust was a luxury, and weakness was a one-way ticket to the grave. Vincent had climbed to power by cutting away every threat, every emotion, every attachment. Yet here he was, hesitating because of one woman, a woman with a calm voice, steady eyes, and no reason to stand before him without fear. Frank sighed, showing for the first time a hint of feeling. "I know Emily needs her, but the girl doesn't understand how this world works. Once they sense your emotions, they'll weaponize them, and she'll be the first they go after." Vincent closed his eyes. In that silence, he could almost hear the echo of small footsteps in the hall. Emily's laughter, Grace's soft humming as she read to the child sounds that had never existed in this house of steel and strategy. He opened his eyes again, not looking at Frank, and murmured, almost to himself, "If I let her go, what happens to Emily?" Frank didn't answer. There was no answer to give. Vincent picked up the first photograph again, Grace holding Emily close, her forehead resting gently against the child's hair. A gesture so simple yet sacred, it made his chest ache. It wasn't physical pain, it was something deeper, older, something he'd buried long ago, the ache of someone who had lost too much, and suddenly realized he still had something left to lose. He said nothing more. No approval. No denial. He simply stared out the window, where darkness was falling, and the weight of his next decision pressed heavy and irreversible. The following morning, the Marino estate was unnervingly still. No giggles from Emily in the living room. No soft rhythm of Grace's voice reading aloud. Everyone moved quietly, cautiously, aware that a storm was gathering behind those stone walls. Rumors spread faster than orders Frank had recommended removing Grace. Vincent had yet to decide. Grace didn't know the details, but she felt it. When she entered the kitchen, servants avoided her eyes. The guards near Emily's room had been rotated. No explanation given. The air felt heavy, damp with dread. Ethan still slept soundly in his little bed while Grace, as always, carried a tray of porridge and warm milk to Emily's room. She knocked softly. No reply. When she pushed open the door, Emily was sitting by the window, hugging her stuffed bear, staring out into the gray garden. The girl didn't turn around, but her voice came, barely above a whisper. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Grace froze. Her heart clenched. "Who told you that?" Emily didn't answer. She turned slowly, eyes glistening, fragile and defiant all at once. "I heard Frank talking to my dad in the library last night. I wasn't asleep. I know they want you to go." Grace set the tray down and knelt beside the wheelchair. "Emily, sometimes adults have difficult things too." But Emily cut her off, trembling but firm. "No, you don't understand. If you go, I go. I'm not staying here without you." The words sliced through the quiet like a blade. Grace stared, stunned. Emily had never raised her voice to anyone, never contradicted an order. But now, this fragile child who once feared footsteps in the hall was defying everything and everyone. "Emily," Grace's throat tightened. "You shouldn't. I should." Emily cried, tears spilling freely. "You're the only one who makes me feel alive. I don't want anyone else. If you leave, I leave." The door opened behind them. Vincent stood there, face grave, eyes shadowed with something between shock and pain. Frank followed, looking as though he'd just witnessed something he shouldn't have. Vincent looked from his daughter to Grace. "Emily, what did you just say?" Emily turned her chair, meeting her father's eyes head-on. Her gaze was so fierce that even Frank looked away. "You always tell me to be strong, but I can't be strong without her. If she leaves, I'm leaving too. I'm not afraid." Silence. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound. Frank drew a careful breath and stepped forward. "Sir, she's a child. She doesn't understand. This isn't a decision to make on emotion. That's enough." "Frank," Vincent interrupted, voice hoarse but commanding. He approached Emily, kneeling, so his eyes were level with hers. "Do you know what you just said?" Emily, "Yes," she whispered, unwavering. "Miss Grace is my family." Vincent closed his eyes. He felt her small hand trembling in his bows. He had heard those words before years ago, from the woman he once loved, before the darkness swallowed them both. Hearing them again now, from his daughter, he knew reason had already lost. He stood, turned to Frank, and spoke with quiet finality. "She's not going anywhere." Frank blinked. "Are you sure?" "Vincent, if the other families find out, I don't care." Vincent cut him off, his tone sharp enough to still the room. "She saved Emily twice. She's not help. She's family." Frank bowed his head, defeated. Grace stood frozen, tears welling and spilling before she could stop them. Emily smiled a trembling, radiant smile, like sunlight breaking through rain. Vincent looked at them, this woman and child, and realized that for the first time in years, his house felt alive. Meanwhile, in a dim basement beneath a luxury hotel in New York, 6 men sat around a long black leather table under the pale glow of a ceiling light. Each one was a name that made the city tremble, men who controlled smuggling routes, underground finance, political strings. But tonight, their meeting wasn't about guns or money. On the screen before them glowed a single image, Grace Delaney holding Emily Marino beneath a blooming rose tree, both smiling softly. The sight silenced the room. The man at the head of the table drew on his cigar and spoke slowly. "That woman, she's just a poor single mother. But she's done what none of us ever dared. She's made Vincent Marino vulnerable." Another man crossed his arms, his tone cold. "Exactly. That makes her a liability. The moment a man like Marino has something to lose, he stops being dangerous." A third man tapped his fingers against the table, eyes dark and thoughtful. "Or maybe she's his greatest weapon. Not a gun, not money, but an image, something the world can sympathize with." a symbol of innocence standing beside a monster. Sometimes goodness is the most dangerous disguise for power. Silence followed. No one disagreed. They all understood one thing: Grace Delaney was no longer ordinary. She had become the variable, the unpredictable force in a world built on control and blood. She hadn't meant to enter their game. Yet her compassion, her courage, her maternal instinct had turned her into the center of every whisper, every plan, every threat. But it was also what made her the one thing Vincent and Emily could never lose. And in a world where everything could be bought, a person who acted not for money or power but simply for what was right was the most terrifying presence of all. Grace's story isn't merely about kindness meeting fate. It's proof that a single act of compassion can change the course of a life, a child, even an empire. In a world as cruel, loud, and deceitful as ours, do you still believe that goodness can create miracles? Thank you for listening to this story to the end. If it touched something in your heart, please subscribe and share this video with those you love. This is Underworld Love Stories, where the light of humanity still burns in the darkest corners. What did you think of Grace and Emily's story? Have you ever witnessed a moment that made you believe kindness can truly alter destiny? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, may you stay healthy, peaceful, and find joy in the smallest corners of life. Goodbye, and see you in the next story.